Mike, it's good to see you.
Hey, Scott. It's good to see you.
Mike Marts is the editor-in-chief of AfterShock Comics and a good friend of mine, doing me the great favor of allowing me to interview him for my first podcast episode. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Scott. It's always good to see you. Usually we're talking to each other on our high school Zoom pandemic COVID meetings.
I want to get into a little bit later on what is making you really excited about what's going on in the entertainment industry and specifically comic book industry in a little bit. But first, I want to go back and have you sort of retell the tale of you dropping out of West Point after being there for a week.
Yeah, roughly a week. Yeah, it was kind of funny. Like the last 2 years of high school, everyone's looking to apply to colleges and trying to get into places. And I didn't really have an idea of what I wanted to do with my life. But my grandfather at the time had a friend who was like a colonel in the Army and had offhandedly kind of mentioned to my grandfather, "Oh, you should try for West Point." And I was like, West Point, all right, United States Military Academy, Army. I've always kind of been into the Army. I would play war when I was a kid and everything, and I like G.I. Joe. So there were certain aspects of being in the Army that sounded pretty cool. And they covered the full tuition. They pay for everything, and it's a great honor, prestige, and the kind of trade-off is that after you do 4 years of schooling with them, in addition to training, you give them 5 years of your life in the military, 5 years of active service.
So 9 years total.
Right, exactly. So it's a 9-year commitment, or it was at the time. I'm not sure if it's the same now. And also, I know that during peacetime, there were, people who were let out of their commitments a year or two early. But, when I was signing up and when I was applying, it was a 9-year commitment. And it was, something I embarked upon. And in addition to your regular college application, there were multiple other applications that you had to fill out. You needed to seek a nomination from a congressman, from a senator, from a governor, from vice president. So I, not only applied to the school, to the academy, but also to my congressman, to Senator Bill Bradley, to Vice President Quayle. So I sent in my applications, all these things. I ended up getting nominated by my congressman and also by Bill Bradley. And then the school accepted me. And, at this point in time, everything's moving so fast and everyone's like, oh, this is great, that the idea of not going never even entered my mind. It was kind of like an automatic thing. It was like, you get accepted at West Point. It's like getting accepted at an Ivy League school or something. So the idea of not going never happened.
If I may interject,
yeah,
being there for that and being one who wasn't that good of a student, or let's just say not a committed student, I remember being super impressed by you and feeling as though your life was set and you had the golden path laid out before you.
Right. That's kind of how it felt. And to make matters worse, there was another member of our class who was going to West Point, and there was 2 guys that were going to the Naval Academy. So it was like this whole rah-rah thing. Four guys from the class of 90 are going to military academies. So, when there's that type of movement and energy behind something, it's kind of hard to derail it or to not be a part of it. So it was kind of an automatic for me to go. And, I went through all the different rituals of the taking physicals with the military beforehand and going to different workshops and everything and all the prep stuff. And And I remember that my life was really going to change about a week after graduation. We would graduate from Immaculata, and a week later, basically, I was going to be leaving for West Point for what they call Beast Barracks, which is essentially their version of basic training. So I graduated. I went down the shore for a week with my family, and then we drove up to West Point, and I started there. And about a week in, about 4 days in, I realized that, this was not something I wanted to do for the next 9 years. And, there were people who thought, like, I didn't give it a fair enough chance. I didn't give it a shot. I'm wasting the opportunity of a lifetime, all this kind of stuff. But it was me sitting in my body. I had to make my own decision. I was only 18, but I knew in my gut that this wasn't what I wanted to do for the next 9 years of my life.
The closest thing I can imagine to how that might feel would be the bride or groom at the altar,
yes,
suddenly realizing, no.
Right. Exactly. Because at that point, all the invitations are set. You're at, the venue. People are cooking your food. The wedding's about to happen. Yeah, it was like that. I was there.
Except the difference is they can get divorced in a week.
Right. Right.
If you stick out this commitment, you're in it for 9 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wrestled with myself for maybe a day or two on how to approach getting out of the place. And I came up with all different types of crazy scenarios in my head. But I ended up going through the process of getting out of there, which is almost as tricky as getting in. They ship you to a place or move you to a place called the transient barracks, which is for all departing cadets. And they tell you the first day you get there, they say, look to your left and look at that person, look to your right, look at that person. One of those people will not be with you at graduation day. There's a 1/3 dropout rate. And I went into the transient barracks about, 6 or 7 days into my stay there. And I was one of the first 10 or 11 people in the transient barracks. And the process of getting out took about another week, where you went through like counseling, and members of your family came up to talk to you, and my parish priest came up to talk to me, just to make sure I was in a right frame of mind and doing the right thing. But after that whole week of going through the transient process, that 10 or 11 people had grown to 50 people. So in the course of a week and a half, there was, 50 people looking to get out. And it made me feel a little bit better about my choice that I wasn't completely alone. But, coming back to reality and coming back to New Jersey and not having a college to go to and it being the middle of the summer, and, having to tell my family and friends, like, hey, I'm home. I didn't do this big thing that you all thought I was going to do, was tough. And very difficult. Stayed with me for a long time. It took a while to shake that.
I remember being at the beach that summer and feeling very concerned for you. Like, there must be something wrong with Mike. In my naive 17-year-old way of thinking about things.
Right. Because, all you guys were getting ready to go off to your colleges, that you had been accepted to Colorado and to Villanova and St. Bonaventure and everything. And everyone was excited. And I was just sitting there, and I wasn't really sure what to do. The other places that I had been accepted to were already full. And I talked to my parents and said, maybe I'll work, get a job and then reapply for the winter semester. And about 2 weeks later of me not finding a job and just kind of hanging around the house, My parents said, all right, that's enough. And they ended up calling St. Joe's in Philadelphia, where my sister had gone, and got me in there somehow. I remember they called up like on a Friday. I drove down the next day for an interview, and I was accepted the day after that.
How long did you spend there, and did you start majoring in?
It was weird. Like I majored in accounting, and that was basically just like my parents, like, being concerned and scrambling, like, okay, jobs that are good and make money, let's go into the hat. And we picked out accountant. Mike's good at math, So, I went to St. Joe's and studied accounting, and St. Joe's was a great school, and I liked it there and everything. But I had this girlfriend back at home, and I was driving back every weekend to see her. And, my father was like, I'm not paying for room and board, when you're not even living there half the time. And so I started looking for a school to go to that was closer to home. And I applied to Trenton State, which is now college in New Jersey. And I got accepted there, and I transferred there for the winter semester. And I ended up loving it at Trenton State. It was a good move. And, the girlfriend and I broke up a few months later. So, that was all for naught.
Were you still the accounting major at Trenton State, or had you shifted towards writing by then?
No, it's funny, man. So I did the accounting at St. Joe's in the first semester, and I liked it. I enjoyed it. I was good at it. I was getting good grades. And then I transferred to Trenton State, and I took, the equivalent of, second semester accounting, and I felt completely lost. I just was, I didn't know what I was doing. I felt like I was trying to catch up to everyone else. And after a few weeks, I was like, I can't do this. And when it came time for accounting class, I would go to the parking lot, and I'd sleep in my car for an hour and a half. And so I just stopped going to the class. And I'm an idiot. I'm ashamed. I'm embarrassed. I didn't know at that point, like, oh, you could drop a class, or I would have done it. So the class stayed on my lineup, and I didn't go, and I ended up failing accounting. And go ahead.
There's an interesting dilemma I'm thinking about in like being a college advisor is, the ability to drop a class exists, but do we really want to promote it? Because a student like the student I was in college would abuse the heck out of it. I would walk into the first class of a semester, and if they handed out like 6 books and said, you've got these, 11 projects due, I'd walk right out of the class and go find another class, because I just was not
right.
At least I knew myself well enough to know that I wasn't doing that.
Right.
Yeah. So at what point did you decide to shift to writing? And then as a corollary to that, when did you start submitting ideas?
Yeah, it was all around that time. I think when I started going into my sophomore year at Trenton State, I found myself gravitating towards English lit classes, towards communications classes, towards journalism, and I made the decision that I was going to switch majors and shift it to journalism, and that process ended up taking a while. I couldn't automatically switch. I had to wait until I got my grades back up to do that. And in the meantime, I just started taking all these classes. I would take creative writing, I would take journalism, I would take English lit, I would take speech writing, all these things. And I found myself loving the classes, loving my professors. And I couldn't wait to actually officially transfer to that major. And around the same time, I just started developing this love for writing. I was writing poetry. I was studying screenplay writing, and comics was always a huge love of mine. And a big goal of mine was to eventually become the X-Men writer. Even though the same guy had been writing X-Men for 15 years at this point, I just figured I would dethrone him. And I got the information on how to submit to Marvel Comics because I was a Marvel Comics guy, and it was a little like photocopy that they mailed me in a Spidey, envelope. And I just, set my mind to it and sat down with my dad's typewriter, and I would bang out a story idea each week, and I would send in my story ideas, one a week. And sometimes I would get the polite rejection letter. Hey, thanks, Mike. We're okay for now. Sometimes I wouldn't get the rejection letter. Sometimes, my pitches would just get sent out into the ether.
Talk for a minute about the idea of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. As you know, I've been talking about podcasting for a very long time because I'm a older dude in his late 40s, and that's what we have to do, right? But it is so easy to get stuck on what the perfect thing would be that you just refuse to even go with the good. And that's the spirit with which I'm trying to move forward right now. And I have a friend who writes a comic, and it's kind of related to aviation and whatnot. And it's really witty and insightful, and and I love his work. And it's a similar thing that he does, where he just says every Monday I'm putting something out there.
Right.
So tell me, how do you overcome that struggle of like, okay, you're submitting one thing a week. What do you do when the thing you've created is not what you love?
Yeah, it's something I guess I've always kind of revolved around and try to live up to. That whole idea of just, as my wife calls it, just showing up. Just going there and delivering something, and not being too finicky about it or too perfectionist about it. I definitely applied it back then with the submitting to Marvel. I would write it, send it in, not get too attached to it. Be mildly disappointed when it wasn't accepted, but keep moving on because I figured eventually I'll get someone's attention. And eventually I did. But yeah, I've always kind of tried to use that approach, just to practice, do, show up, do stuff, and gradually your material, whatever it is, if it's writing, music, whatever, it should get better with time. It's kind of like Lil Wayne, like, think what you will about him, politics aside and craziness and committing crimes and everything. But that dude like shows up and like every 6 weeks, like he's got a new album out. Like during the pandemic, that guy like put out like 5 or 6 different EPs. He just shows up. He just shows up. He creates a few songs and just puts it out. And that's kind of the same approach I took back then with submitting stories to Marvel. And at the same time, I started working full time at a comic book store like during my time in college. I didn't live at college. I just took classes and I came home and I went to work, and then at night I'd hang out with you guys, But I was so dedicated on the writing and trying to make the comics thing happen that I, working at this comic book store became a big thing for me because it allowed me to kind of meet real comic professionals and realize that there was a real business involved with comics. And it kind of led me towards establishing some friendships that led to me being introduced to actual editors at Marvel people that would take a real hard look at my story pitches rather than it just being, on top of a slush pile.
So your first opportunity was the opportunity for that internship, right? Between junior and senior year?
Yeah, that was around that same time. I was still pitching and sending in stories, and this guy that I had become friends with, his name was Mckenna. He's an inker, and he was a longtime Marvel employee, and he lived in Bound Brook in my town. So there was a lot of connections, and he was a super nice guy. And he not only hand delivered my pitches into Marvel to editors, but he also recommended that I apply for an editorial internship. And at that time, I was so focused and intent on the writing end of things that uh, I kind of had to take the blinders off and realize, oh, well, there's this whole other creative aspect of the comics publishing business, which is editorial, which is partially writing and partially conception of stories, but so much more. It's the coaching of talent, it's behind the scenes, it's arranging storylines, it's figuring out a publishing plan. It's, there was so many different parts to it beyond just the writing of a story. And that's what I really latched onto, and then was lucky enough to get an internship at the end of my junior year in college.
So was there a part of you that was a little bit bummed that he was corralling you into the editorial avenue versus having you simply, work on writing? And
No,
the second,
no, because I mean, his idea was that it was more about the networking for me. That getting in there as an editorial intern wouldn't necessarily mean I'd become an editor, but that it would allow me to make connections and meet people and impress people. And maybe that would lead to writing, maybe it would lead to editing, but his idea was the networking of it.
how long did it take for you to feel as though you were sort of like where you should be, that you were like not faking it, that you were like a worthy part of the team?
I fell in love with the place immediately. I was in there 3 days a week. I was living down the shore at the time in a house with 8 other people. I had no money to my name. I had a little money in my savings, and what little money I had, I would feed myself on. I would buy 1 bagel a day and a Snapple a day, and that's what I ate every day. And then I would hope there'd just be food laying around the house that I could eat. But my money was spent towards a train ticket into the city to do the internship, and that whole summer I became a student. I would absorb everything. I kept a journal. Everything I learned, everyone I met, I would write down, and I just studied the whole editorial process. My train rides were 2 hours long, back and forth, so 4 hours a day. And for those 4 hours on the train, I would write a screenplay. So I would just like practice my writing, and I wrote a screenplay over the summer. So I was still practicing writing, but falling in love with editorial while I was doing the internship. And by the end of the summer, I remember I was invited to like the company picnic, and I went to the picnic, and I still felt like an outsider. I didn't talk to many people. I was like, just shy, introverted, and then some of the assistant editors, young guys, invited me to a party that was taking place after the picnic, and I was like, oh shit, like I got invited to a party. There's going to be editors there and everything. And I went to that. I still remember it was like in Jersey City, someone's tiny apartment. And that's kind of like the moment I felt like, all right, I'm accepted. I'm one of them. I kind of, became a part of the fabric there, and I never wanted to leave. So, I enrolled for a second internship there, which was, for whatever reason, frowned upon by the editor-in-chief at the time. His thought was that familiarity breeds contempt. And he didn't like repeat interns, but my boss at the time talked him into it, and I was able to do a second internship.
Is your boss at the time the one who ultimately ended up hiring you into Marvel at the end of that internship?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. What I didn't know at the time was that, him and his assistant editor weren't working out. And he was looking for a new assistant editor. And I was like, hire me. I wanted to interview. I wanted that job so bad. And I remember interviewing for it and like waiting for a while, not knowing if I was getting it. What I didn't know is that in his head, he was going to pick me no matter what, but I didn't know that. But he ended up having this kind of big fight with his boss, the editor-in-chief, because he said, he went to bat for me. He was like, I want to hire Mike as my assistant, but he still has a half year left of school to finish. And the editor-in-chief, this guy, Tom DeFalco, he was like, you could hire him, but that fucking kid better fucking finish college. And so, Nell, my boss, Nell Yomtov, he made me promise. He's like, you got to finish, school, if you take this job. And I was like, absolutely. So I took the job. I started I think my birthday, late December of 93. And then the January semester started, and I would do a full day of work at Marvel in New York City, and then drive down to Trenton State to take night class. And I did that for about 2 weeks. And then I said, I can't do this. It was too difficult. So I just kind of stopped taking classes.
What if the editor-in-chief found out that you had stopped taking classes? Was it sort of like he was like, the uncle who cared about you type of thing?
Exactly. I think after a while, then I was part of the staff and everything. And, I don't know if he even bothered to check in on it.
When did you finish college?
It was 3 years later. And what I ended up doing was, it was only 5 classes I needed to finish. I ended up taking 2 rinky-dink computer classes at a nearby community college and transferred the credits. And then 3 years later, I left Marvel and I went back and I finished out the last 3 classes, I think over the summer.
So when you left Marvel, where'd you go from there?
That was a tough thing at the time. Marvel, everyone knows the story now. Marvel ended up going bankrupt, and this was leading up to the bankruptcy. And Marvel had been this huge heyday and big parties and tons of people on staff and everything. And then everything started to implode, and they bought up too many companies. They got too fat, and profits started shrinking. And then one year there was layoffs, and I survived one round of layoffs, but I was 22 years old, 23 years old. I was like, holy shit, I'm experiencing real corporate life for the first time. And then a year later, there was another round of layoffs, and, the staff got reduced to a third of what it was. And I survived that one too. And my boss, this guy, Nell, he was let go. And he had been with the company for 25 years. But, he made good money, and I guess they figured he was a good cut to make. But it devastated me. I was like, I can't understand how they would fire this guy. And around the same time, 2 other people that were long staffers at Marvel ended up dying. And, to a 24-year-old, seeing all these layoffs and my boss get fired and 2 people die, I was like, this, I don't know if I want to be here anymore. So I thought this is a good time to go finish my degree, and that's what I did. And then I started interviewing to get back into the industry. Marvel didn't have anything at the time. And I interviewed at DC Comics for about 6 or 7 different assistant editor jobs. I didn't get any, and then I ended up getting a job at this place called Wizard, which was a magazine about comic books.
Really?
Yeah,
So,
but yeah.
On your resume, you've got ultimately at Marvel, you became executive editor, most notably for X-Men and Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
And you've worked on Black Panther, Deadpool, Iron Man at Marvel. So, what does it mean to be an executive editor? Like, what does it mean to be the executive editor of the X-Men comic books?
So, with at any comic book publishing company, especially, I mean, like the big two, Marvel or DC, not only are there individual titles, like Iron Man comes out once a month and Fantastic Four comes out and Spider-Man comes out, but there's also within the publishing line families of books or franchises of books. So, the X-Men was so popular that they had more than one book. There was Uncanny X-Men, there was Astonishing X-Men, there was a ton of other X-Men books I'm forgetting right now. And then there's the solo character books. So, these franchises, whether it was X-Men or Avengers, could support multiple titles. And an executive editor, more or less, would be in charge of a family, a group of publishing. And at the time that I went back to Marvel for my third and final stint there, I was executive editor of the X-Men books and the Guardians of the Galaxy books. And that was a lot of different titles, and different editors worked underneath me. So in addition to just kind of being in charge of the individual titles, it was kind of shaping the franchise or the family of titles.
So in doing that job, and it doesn't have to be specifically about X-Men, what are some of the hardest things you have to confront when it comes to people and or managing expectations and or redirecting people?
Well, working with creators, even though comic books is kind of a small industry, it's still similar to things like sports or music or film and television, in that they're artists, and depending on their popularity, people can skyrocket overnight from being a relative unknown creator to being a super popular person, and going from having a low page rate to being on contract with a huge page rate and a signing bonus. So being able to manage those different types of talent at different levels can be a tricky thing. And knowing that a guy or girl who starts off here at the start of the year could be up here at the end of the year, that takes some delicate maneuvering too. So you kind of have to always respect the talent and treat them as if they might always be stars. And that's not to treat them like prima donnas, because you are still their boss. But there's a certain amount of creative respect that goes into it. And it's just kind of one of the things that goes into the job.
How often, if ever, does it get to the point where you either have to draw the line with someone and say, listen, this way it's going isn't working here in this situation. And, I have to imagine artists, creative types. I understand Bill Parcells. What I heard about him as a football coach was that he was the master of knowing that this guy needed to be yelled at and screamed and tore down to be motivated. And I need to treat this other guy like a delicate flower over here. I could be wrong. I think that was Bill Parcells.
No, that's right. It was him, and yeah, it's a similar way of maneuvering with the talent that we work with in comics, and it can happen pretty often, and it would often happen usually when someone's vision gets interrupted by something else, and it could be something as simple as the way that these characters behave and act, because as an editor, you're a caretaker of these characters who have been around for 80 years. Batman behaves a certain way. He says certain things. He wouldn't do certain things. And sometimes a creator's vision might run up against that, and that's conflict. But more often than not, it might be something that arises with, because it's a shared universe and they're shared toys. And maybe Scott Corley is the main writer of Captain America, but Mike Marts is the writer of Avengers, and Captain America's on the Avengers. So you might be having Captain America do something in your book, but I might want to have something. And so, there's sometimes conflict when it comes to the shared universe and figuring out, well, who gets dibs or who gets to do this, and coming up with solutions to that is something you develop as an editor. Or it could be conflict of kind of like an overall company directive, a big storyline that's taking place where X, Y, and Z need to happen, but this writer doesn't want to do X. So then what do you do?
So what happened to incentivize you to shift from Marvel and go be the Batman group editor for DC?
It was a combination of a few different things. It was, opportunity. At the time I left Marvel, I'd been there in two different stints of 10 years. So it was a long time. I had kind of achieved my goal of working on the X-Men. At the time I left, I'd been the X-Men group editor for a number of years. I had gotten most of the books to the point where I was really happy with them, with good creative teams and in a direction. And sometimes that takes a while, but I was in a happy place with where the books were. And, there was also, the question of advancement. I was high up in terms of the editorial structure, but to keep getting higher, I kind of had to wait for a few guys to either leave the company or die, So it's not that I felt stuck, but I did feel that there was certain opportunity for advancement at DC. And I'd also become friendly with the guy who was running DC at the time, and I really respected his way of doing things and his energy. And ultimately, that's what led me to go there. And ironically, growing up being a Marvel kid and loving Marvel and wanting nothing more than to work at Marvel, DC became my home more than Marvel ever had been, and strangely enough. And I really pictured myself working at DC forever.
So you've worked on a lot of superhero comic books.
Yes, almost everyone.
Which superhero is your favorite and why?
Batman is my favorite comic character of all time. The why
was that the case before you worked on Batman?
Yeah. I mean, growing up as a small kid, even before I started reading comics, Batman
Adam
was
West.
Yeah, exactly. And I had a cape I wore around all the time, and Batman was, he was the dude.
Like what about him? I mean, come on, you're the editor. You got to be able to unpack this a little bit.
Batman put the needs of the city in front of his own needs. He was selfless. He didn't have superpowers. He relied on his intellect, his wit, his physical strength. And to me, that was, that meant that, if this guy could do it, I could do it. Because he's human. He doesn't have powers. I could go out and fight crime. But the idea that he was noble, he was selfless. That's what I gravitated towards.
He was the archetype in certain ways, at least in the book, of some of those virtues. And would you say that most of those virtues are things you have to embrace or get good at practicing to kind of be successful in your industry and or any other industry?
I would think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
When we last talked, you told me that you fell in love with both Batman and X-Men as a child, and that you always felt this sort of tension of measuring your own work and hoping that it would be good enough as the thing you loved in the past. Like, what was the balance, and was that good for your creative energy to sort of be measuring and comparing yourself like that? And like,
yeah, it
what
was,
percent of that sort of nervous energy was helpful versus kind of, sucking the joy out of the process?
I think most of it was helpful. It definitely kept me in check, but it would make me, I don't know if nervous is the right word, but working on the X-Men was a lifelong goal. And then I got handed the keys, and taking that on, there was, there were certain storylines that were already in motion. So for a while, it's kind of seeing someone else's vision through and shepherding it. But then there comes a point where your own decisions come into play, and choosing creators, coming up with storylines. And at that point, you are measuring what you're currently doing against the classics of the past, the stuff you grew up on, the stuff that you glorify, the books that you love, the stories that you love, because in your eyes, it'll be tough to measure up to that. That was a real struggle, and it pushed me to always try to do better and get good talent and do the right storylines. It wasn't always easy, because I think the ways of publishing comics evolved since the time that I was reading them as a kid. So you couldn't even really do the same types of comics, in terms of content, in terms of how you arrange storylines. But it drove me to try to do my best. And I don't even think that by the time I stopped working on X-Men, I knew I left the books in a good place, and I knew I was happy with where they're at, but I wasn't sure how my career measured up against other X-Men editors of the past. I mean, there was one guy, Bob Harris, who did the X-Men during the 90s and 80s, and he brought in so much great talent, and so many good things happened during that time. And I always aspired to be like him, and tried to be like him. And I would ask him, for tips and things. But it wasn't until I think a few years after working on the X-Men that, I would meet creators, or I'd meet fans, or I'd meet people at conventions like, oh yeah, man, your X-Men runs, that's my favorite stuff ever. That's what I grew up on. Or that's the first time I read X-Men was your stuff. And then, I look back and I'm like, all right, well, this was some good shit.
That's good.
Batman
How
was
old were
easier.
you?
Yeah.
How old were you when you finally were able to sort of take that look back and have that satisfaction without feeling like you were risking being sort of cocky or brash? Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I don't know. 40?
Yeah.
Yeah. 40.
You got to be at least that old. If you think you're that awesome at 28,
yeah.
you're either insanely awesome and you're just going to have an out of control ego, or maybe you're not.
Right.
So,
and let me add, Batman was easier because even though I was a huge Batman fan, I didn't read DC Comics that much growing up, so I wasn't familiar with the stories as much. So when I came in and I started working on Batman, I didn't have all these things in my mind that I had to measure up against. I just kind of started fresh and just ran.
So something you just said a minute ago made me think of making mistakes and failing. One of my favorite leaders, especially of the last 4 years, was Secretary or General James Mattis. And I read his book on leadership, and he talks about how every time he made a mistake, he ended up getting promoted. And it was speaking more to how do you recover from a mistake?
Mm-hmm.
As you look back at your career, how often did you see yourself making mistakes of any significant level? And how do you think you recovered? And then to add on to that question, because I'm sure you've seen many people come and go in the industry, do you see that there is an art in how the successful people make mistakes but sort of fail forward, and versus the common mistakes people will make who end up not being successful or not going anywhere or gnashing their teeth because they're not achieving what they were hoping to achieve?
Right. Well,
And I'm sorry, I'm not asking for you to, shit talk anybody.
No, but I mean, there have been some hard lessons and hard mistakes, and you need to learn from them. I've been fired from a job at Wizard, and that led to me learning how to deal with things in a certain way. But problems are going to arise no matter what. Sometimes they're going to be of your own making, sometimes they're going to be of other people's making, sometimes they're just going to happen. But getting out in front of it early and addressing it and recognizing it rather than hiding it or thinking it's just going to go away, getting out in front of it is the best thing to do. It took me a while to learn that. But especially in something like comics where it's a printed page, all right? And thousands of people are going to read it. And it's going to be there forever. So mistakes that happen like that, you've got to get out in front of it early. That's certainly one lesson that I had to learn along the way.
I see that, well, not just in my industry, but everywhere in life. And I think that I couldn't agree more about the getting out ahead in front of it. No one's expecting anyone to be perfect. Well, I mean, some people do, but just getting out ahead of your mistakes. That's awesome. So we'll get to AfterShock in a second, but right now, what is currently jazzing you about the comic book industry and the entertainment industry in general?
The comic book industry, it's we persevere. We've gone through ups and downs or cycles. There's been big moments and low moments. I think a lot of people initially thought that COVID-19 was going to affect the comic book industry in a big way because they're primarily sold out of small retail stores, and these stores barely exist as it is. But it's such a dedicated hardcore audience that people just keep showing up for the new comics. It's escapism. And 2020 ended up being a better year for us than previous years. In terms of sales, growth, and relationships with retailers. And and creators, film and television. So, I mean, the comic industry, it excites me these days just because of everything we've been through and how we're able to kind of come out the other side stronger than before. It's a tight knit group, and it's a strong group.
What percentage of people who read comic books ever read them in like PDF form?
It's low. The digital audience is one that's, digital comics have been around over a decade now. There are certain people who do it a lot, but it's relatively a small percentage. It's, probably between 10 and 15% of overall readers read their stuff digitally. And it's funny because digital keeps growing and growing in other areas. So you'd think that digital comics would have grown as well, but I think it kind of goes back to the fact that the comic is not just a unit of entertainment, it's also a collectible. And people like to have that in their hands. They like to add it to their collection. They like to put it on their bookshelf. They don't like to file it away. They're proud of it. So it gets a special spot on the shelf or in a comic box.
So I'm kind of thinking about, I'm a Rush fan. Now I'm on this Rush Fanatics Facebook page.
Right.
But, I mean, I love Rush. They are my favorite band, but when I see other people on there, I'm quite clearly not a Rush fanatic.
Right.
I don't mean to offend any artist because I know it's not particularly the best deal, but I listen to them on Spotify and Apple Music. I'm not buying vinyl, but I have to imagine that, like, I know that there are, Rush fans who will buy a vinyl record so that they can listen to it. And then they'll buy the vinyl record so that can be on their wall or in the, and never be, touched. I got to imagine in comic books, there is a subsection subgroup of comic book readers that, buy a couple issues of each issue just so that they can have the one that gets handled and the other one that gets stored all nicely.
There are, there's probably not as much as you think, but there are the super collectors, and those are the people who have the big Batman statues that are, limited edition sitting on their shelf. And there are people like that. And it's a percentage of the readership, but the majority of the readership is just your average happy consumer. They get their comic, they read it, they put it in a bag, and they file it away.
Okay. So you mentioned a handful of AfterShock comics that you're particularly excited about, and a couple are in the pipeline for movies. Can you talk about any of that which is going on and what you're excited about?
Yeah, it's exciting. We've been fortunate enough to have a good amount of Hollywood interest in our properties in our library, especially over the last year or so. But recently we had a book called Kaiju Score, which was kind of like a big heist, Ocean's 11 type story, but set in a world where big giant monsters like Godzilla existed. And that we announced that book early, a lot earlier than when it was coming out, because during the early days of the quarantine, we decided we want to kind of get out with a bunch of good news. So we kind of announced some things early, and this book ended up getting picked up by Sony Pictures even before the first issue had hit stands, or before there was the actual first issue to read. And And that kind of goes back to, a few things. It's, one shows, makes us feel good that we're creating good content and quality content and stuff that's interesting to people. But it also shows that there is just this insatiable just need for content, for film and television. I mean, the streamers have not really slowed down to the extent that you think they have during this past year. I mean, they are actively acquiring projects and looking to add more in these. Yeah. Go ahead.
If you're still listening at this point in the conversation, I'm hoping that on some level you find listening to be of some value. All I ask in return for your enjoyment of this podcast is to share it with someone. Anyone. Social media would be great, but sharing it with one friend would still be doing me a favor. I'm really enjoying this journey I'm on in creating this content. The best way you can help me is by subscribing to my podcast and my YouTube channel and sharing this content with others. Thanks so much for helping.
You got to imagine that with a franchise like The Avengers being one of the most successful, profitable movie franchises of all time, the people who are backing, funding the movie projects are looking to, make stuff like that hit. Because, I mean, what percentage of people who watch an Avenger movie do you think have ever read an Avengers comic book?
Very few,
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And that is one kind of sad part about the industry, is that we still haven't quite figured out how to get those people that show up to watch the Avengers movie to actually pick up the comic book too. But that's a whole podcast in and of itself. But yeah, I mean, not just Avengers, but so many times these days, things that you're watching on film, television, people don't even realize that they originally came from a comic book. Lock and Key, Umbrella Academy, Warrior Nun. Like, there's tons of things on the streamers now that originated as a comic book, and people don't even know. But that's where people look now for original ideas, and the reason being is that it's a prepackaged idea. It's something which exists. You can read it, you can see it visually, you can envision how it's going to appear on screen, and the blueprints are all there for you.
So, being editor-in-chief of AfterShock, do you get involved in marketing at all?
Yeah.
Okay, so towards your previous point, how much effort do you put into trying to draw new segments of the population into, the comic book world versus effectively marketing to the existing comic book world?
Yeah, it's a tough nut to crack. One of our primary goals is just to create good content, to create good books. But you can't just hope that the audience is going to show up. You really have to try to cater certain ideas towards certain types of viewers, certain types of readers. And that is a tricky part. And it's not my strongest area, so I'm glad I'm not the marketing guy. But I certainly do get involved in those discussions.
How is AfterShock Comics different than other more traditional comic book players?
Well, when people think of comic books, they mainly think of Marvel or DC or Archie. And, these are characters, concepts, franchises, families that have been around for decades. The primary difference is that these characters are owned by those companies. So Iron Man and Avengers are owned by Marvel and Disney, and Batman and Superman are owned by DC, Warner Brothers. So when a Batman movie gets made, DC makes money. When an Avengers movie gets made, Marvel makes money. Our model is something which is called creator-owned, which allows the creators that we work with to have a certain degree of ownership in the projects that they conceive. So they partner with us as a publisher to help bring their vision to life, to help create their story and to put it in comic book form. And then they have ownership in that property, so that if something like Kaiju Score, like I just mentioned, gets picked up as a movie, the creator or creators of Kaiju Score can stand to make a profit from that. So it incentivizes creators to want to come work with us as opposed to mainstream publishing. It incentivizes them to tell their best stories with us. And that's the primary difference. Also, you know, the bigger companies are more focused on superhero stuff. And while we have done a few superhero stories, most of our projects are not. You know, they're sci-fi, they're horror, they're crime, they're fantasy, they're more genre specific.
So when you had the opportunity with AfterShock and you knew you were going to be shifting from dealing with a whole bunch of superheroes to more of the genre-driven type stuff, were you a little nervous at first? Like, is this going to be the right call? Or did you kind of feel like you were going right into your wheelhouse?
Yeah, I just kind of felt like I was going into my wheelhouse. I mean, I've been asked that question a few times, and I never approached the creation of a comic or putting together of a comic any different at AfterShock than I did at any of my previous jobs. So I approach it as a story that has heroes in it, and trying to tell the best story possible and getting the talent to do their best work. But I don't really treat it any differently, just because they're not wearing capes.
What year did AfterShock start?
We started in, I have to do it, 2015. So we announced in April of 2015, and then our first book came out in December of that year.
So in making the shift to AfterShock, how much of that was your ideas that helped, you know, start the brand, and how much of it was people coming to you going, hey man, would you be interested? Like, is this a job you interviewed for, or like how did it all form? If you can speak to that.
Yeah, sure. There was a few partners that existed in the company prior to my coming on. They were in the initial phases of conceiving what type of company it would be and what type of books they would do, but they hadn't really got off the ground yet, and they were looking for someone to run creative and to run editorial. And a guy that I had known for a long time, this is my partner, Joe Pruitt. He contacted me over Facebook Messenger one night, like during Christmas vacation, and was telling me about this thing he was starting up, this company, and it was intriguing to me. It was the right thing at the right time, and I flew out to LA to meet all the guys and interviewed with them, and they brought me on as a partner and as editor-in-chief, and I never looked back.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You've worked with some interesting people and some famous people, sort of coming off the end of what you were talking about with the AfterShock business model. Robert Kirkman, who wrote The Walking Dead, wasn't he one of the first people to kind of have that business model where he owned his comic? And so therefore when Walking Dead got picked up, he did well, as opposed to if you're just some Batman writer, you're not making an ounce off of Ben Affleck
Right.
in a man suit.
Yeah. I mean, Robert wasn't like the absolute first. There was other guys or girls who might have come before who sold something that they owned to film or TV, but Robert was certainly the first to hit big. Walking Dead becomes, along with Game of Thrones, probably the biggest TV show of all time. And Robert is such a nice, cool, down-to-earth guy that everyone in the comic industry knew him. Like, either you worked with him on a book or you'd see him at conventions, or, you'd run into him on panels. So everyone knew Robert, and there was no denying Robert's talent. But he was able to do it in a very successful way. And it happened quickly once it started happening. And that's when I think the allure of creator owns really kind of became attractive to a lot of creators, where, they said, I want to be like Robert Kirkman. I want to have a TV show with 12 seasons on the air and be an executive producer and write episodes and have a whole franchise that, is dedicated to my name.
So how did you collaborate with Robert?
Robert was certainly a guy I knew from conventions. I would see him there, and I believe we only worked on one project together. It was a X-Men special, like, one shot that was like, it was gonna be painted artwork, and it was either Iceman or Phoenix, or it was a single character. And it probably would have been around 2004 or 5. So he was certainly writing Walking Dead at the time as a comic, but it hadn't been born into the big TV show yet. And, so we did that book together. We had a good time. He did some other work at Marvel, for some of my other editorial friends. And then he went on, to mainly focus on his own stuff, but he was someone that I always enjoyed seeing at conventions. And, even, when I see him now and he's, big Mr. Robert Kirkman, he still, is just a good guy. And,
That's cool.
Says hi.
Okay. I want to know what it's like to work with Kevin Smith, and what did you work with him on?
Kevin.
I just love, I'm always amused by him, and I really, I don't go down the rabbit hole with his work a lot, but it's just, I never look at anything he does or any posts he's putting on social media, and I'm always at the very least, amused and entertained by it.
Yeah, Kevin's such a special guy. And he's another one of these guys like Robert Kirkman. Like, Kevin's just a normal guy from Jersey that loved movies and loved comics. And, he made his life's work just from trying and trying.
If he did nothing other than Clerks, he'd still be
a legend.
Hugely important.
Right. Exactly. So Kevin, everyone knows he's a lifelong comic fan. He owns a comic book store in Red Bank, New Jersey. And he would, do his own comics as he was growing up and everything. He did some work at Marvel, and then he was doing some work at DC on a Batman limited series. And he did one limited series, and it did really well. And so then, of course, the bosses wanted to do a sequel series. And around this time, I was the Batman editor. And my boss was like, hey, do you want to work with this on Kevin? I was like, yeah, sure. Sounds great. And Kevin was interesting because like I go back to what I was saying before about being caretakers of characters and shepherds of characters and everything, and Batman acts a certain way and everything, and I would get Kevin's scripts in, and they were fun, action packed, entertaining, intriguing, and everything, and then I'm going through, and it's like, all right, Batman's making a dick joke, and Batman's making a fart joke, and I'm like, fuck. I'm like, what do I do? I'm like,
How do I
like,
corral Kevin
right,
Smith?
right.
Like,
So
there's an asymmetry going on there,
right,
know?
and and there's a certain give and take here, because obviously we're asking Kevin to do Batman books because Kevin has star power and these books are going to sell and everything. At the same time, we are caretakers of these characters who have been around for 80 years and everything. So, it was, I went to my boss for advice, and I showed him my concerns and everything. And he was like, all right, we'll try to get him to take away the dick joke, but we'll let him have the fart joke. And I think that's kind of how it ended up. I think, we let him have, keep the fart joke or the poop joke, whatever it was. But working with Kevin was tricky, and not just because of Kevin or who he was, but he cared about what he was creating. I mean, he was working on movies and podcasts in his store, but this comic was really important to him. And I remember one day I was in San Diego and I was walking along the beach with our mutual friend Anthony, and I get a buzz on my phone, and I look down. I'm like, Ant, I got to take this. He's like, yeah, no problem. I'm like, it's Kevin Smith. And Ant's like, what? And I pick it up. I'm like, hey, Kevin. He's like, flag on the play. And I'm like, uh-oh, what's going on? And there had been some art changes that we had made to the book in an effort to what we thought kind of make it feel better. But Kevin really wanted to kind of stick with how the artwork had looked originally. And so, it was, he was good about it, but it was a tough call. It was kind of like one of those, like, I had to, eat some crow and kind of go back and undo something, which we did, and that we thought was for the right reasons. So, it was fun. But Kevin was great. And when my daughter was born, he ended up sending her like a little gift and everything. And I'll never forget that.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And I
That's
tried to
really
tell
cool.
her, I'm like, this is from Kevin Smith. And she's like, who?
Well, his post on some social media platform is why I asked you if you watched The Mandalorian.
Oh, yeah. Mandalorian for sure. Hold on. I'm just going to turn the light on.
Sure thing.
Yeah, Mandalorian.
Now, come on. You had to have seen the end of season 2 by now, have you not?
I have. Yes.
All right. So, spoiler alert. We're going to talk about it, people. So, if you do not want to know how the end of The Mandalorian season 2 goes, skip forward. I will put it in the notes as far as when we get to the next section. How awesome was that?
It was. I didn't think they could top season 1, and season 2 was just incredible. Not only with reintroducing Boba Fett in an awesome way, the unmasking of the Mandalorian, the heartache of him and the kid being torn apart, Luke Skywalker coming back and just fucking up shit.
I've got goosebumps right now just thinking of that scene of Luke Skywalker because they knew how to just ride you right there at the edge, because you're sitting there with I was sitting there with my sons and be like, is that Luke Skywalker? And you're like, because you just it can't be Luke Skywalker.
I know. You see the green lightsaber, you see the black cloak.
Yeah. And then those bastards leave you with, after you ponder it all, did Baby Yoda get killed by Kylo Ren and the Knights of Ren? Do you think we're ever going to get to know that?
Where did you come up with that?
Luke Skywalker took him away to train him at the, his Jedi camp.
Oh man,
that didn't end well, right?
No.
I mean, I don't know. What do you think ever became of Grogu? I like to imagine he's chilling in Dagobah somewhere, training, new Jedi. But I just,
right.
I'm not sure he's alive when Rey, finally gets the gold saber.
Right.
I don't know. Well, man, I really appreciated. Oh wait, no, one last thing.
Yeah.
Have you heard of this band called the Ninja Nine?
Yeah.
Dude, what do you think of them?
Brilliant stuff.
I gotta say, it's been a while since I've sort of listened to the that style of an album and really got into it, because it's really cool, because while there are some words, it has no lyrics. And I just thought that the way that especially on the on the first album, the way that all of the songs flowed from one song to the next. What do you think that they were thinking when they put like Sic Mundus Creatus Est, in front of Solstice, and I found that, like, during the holidays and doing all the honeydew things around the house, it was a very soothing things to have going through my AirPods, and I felt like there's a sense of, like, you're not sure exactly what's being said, but you get it all the same.
Right. Well, I will say this, that this band that I am involved in, came about in the middle of the pandemic. And, after exhausting puzzles and board games and, doing other things at home, both my wife and I were kind of looking for creative outlets, like ways to just kind of do things creatively with all this time at home. And she took up her artwork and sketching again and was doing that. And for a while I was thinking about maybe I'll try to write this novel that I'd been toying with for a while. And I tried that for a day or two, and I just found that after doing the stories and comic books all day long, that at the end of the day, I didn't have the energy or enthusiasm to kind of keep going on DJ and writing. So I kind of went back to my teenage days where I would DJ and I would do mixtapes, and I used to DJ Sweet 16 parties and stuff, and I had my own rap band called the Dope University, where we created beats and everything. And I decided I was going to try to, I'm not a musician, I don't know how to read music, but I was going to take up creating music. And I taught myself how to use GarageBand. I taught myself music production basically just through like YouTube courses and Udemy courses and master classes. And I just absorbed everything. And I was like, I'm going to try to put out an album before I turn 50. And so that was kind of the genesis of the Ninja Nine.
And then the Ninja Nine didn't just put out one album.
No,
they put out 2 albums in 2 weeks?
Yeah, well, I kind of had to take 2 albums in 2 weeks.
How much of that was already created from before the first one was released?
The first album, Pandemia, took a while. It took a few months, and that was a lot of experimentation. And eventually, I had to take my own advice, like with Lil Wayne and what my wife would say, like just show up and just do. Don't stop trying to make it perfect, because I I had envisioned like this concept album and this whole story and everything. And then I just kind of ended up going with individual ideas and stringing them together, kind of making them a whole afterwards. But yeah, it took me a few months to get the first album together. And then the second album I did in like 2 weeks. I just sat down. I was like, I'm going to do a song a day, and I'm going to make them just these 1 minute song blasts. So it came really quickly. And then like the third one, which isn't out yet, it's going really quickly. And the third one is it's basically like a DJ set from like a dance club or something. Like envision you were at some dance club 4 years ago and this DJ was playing, and we ended up recording it, and that's what's coming out on this album.
Cool.
Yeah.
I look forward to it.
A lot of heavy bass and techno beats and everything.
Yeah. I just got to say, first off, I didn't realize that, that the track Chadwick was, I got a friend named Chad, and, sometimes I affectionately call him Chadwick. And when that came after the song "Let Me Inner Space," which had that amazing guitarist.
Yeah, some guest guitars.
Yeah. When it came after that, for some reason, I was just stuck in my own little, oh wow, it's like my friend Chad, yada yada yada. And then my kids were like, "That's Chadwick." I'm sorry,
Boseman.
his name Boseman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever have the chance to meet him?
No, never. I got to meet a few of the Guardians of the Galaxy stars, but I never met Chadwick Boseman. It would have been really cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was kind of fun doing. That came after I did this tribute song for Kobe Bryant.
That was cool. I got that right from the get-go. That was,
Yeah, and then right around the time I finished doing Kobe, Chadwick Boseman died, and I just thought I would do one for him too. And so eventually, at some point, I'm going to do one for Alex Trebek as well, but I haven't started it yet.
Of all of the grooves that have been put together by the Ninja Nine, do you have a favorite? And you don't have to say "Let Me Inner Space" because I'm.
Yeah, there's this one on the second album called Brunswick.
Okay.
And yeah, each
last
song,
one.
Yeah, the last one. Yeah, each song on the second album is named for a town in New Jersey, and this one, I kind of love just like the samples that I used on it. There's this girl's voice that goes like, "Hey y'all," and my daughter keeps thinking it's Elmo, but it's not Elmo. And but anyway, I love the way that track worked out, and I actually built on that track and expanded it on my third album to I let it grow into something bigger.
So one of the cool things that's I got to do this weekend was hang out with a good friend in Colorado, and he is all about music. He's a pilot, but he's just like the most sort of, creative, expressive, punk rock pilot in the world.
Right.
He saved up all of his money to go to flight school and put himself through flight school by working in the Ritz-Carlton in Cleveland, Ohio, near the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And which is just couldn't be a more perfect job for him. He has a personality that just, doesn't fit in any room because it's so big, but also so fun, but also so kind and so humble, like all at the same time. And so he turns me on to new music all the time. Couple of the new things that I'm listening to, and I don't know what it is. Typically, I don't go looking for like, I just typically lean on a lot more like male hard music.
Right.
And he finds all of these really cool, female artists like have you ever heard of Larkin Poe?
No.
Check them out. They're like bluesy and just the deepest, most like, or the most like soulful voice. They're two sisters, and Larkin Poe is their great-great-grandfather, and he was cousins of Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, weird.
And so that's why they named the band Larkin Poe. And like the first time I listened to them, I reverted to like my 12-year-old, competitive flannel wearing, brain. I was like, this is just chicks playing blues, you know what I mean? Like, they're not that good. But this weekend, he like reintroduced me to them like he did a year ago. And suddenly it just like, it took, and I went down like YouTube rabbit holes, watching them do all these really cool covers. Like they do this cover of Iron Man, which is awesome. And they just put out this album that's got a cover of Rockin' in the Free World, but done with a totally different arrangement. And I just say, so it's like stuff that's getting me like excited about creating again, because I want to repeat not only in potential collaboration with the Ninja Nine some point in the future, but also, making my own stuff with some other friends and whatnot. And it's so hard. I got to say, I really envy your ability to just show up, not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so, my commitment to myself, well, and also the reason for doing this podcast is that I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna quit telling myself it's got to be perfect, and be okay with, what, sometimes it might not even be good. And I really, really just, appreciate you showing up and being here for it, man.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. I'll show up again.
I appreciate it, brother.
I'm good, man. I think this was an awesome conversation.
Cool, man. Well, I really appreciate it. And I you are the perfect person to start with, because I know you just have such a generous spirit of a personality that I knew that you would handle my fragile little ego safely.
I would say yes. Yeah.
You would say yes, but I also knew that if it got a little weird, you would help. I'd
steer you.
You just steer me in the right direction.